1,000 years ago, the people of Europe lived beneath the shadow of something they could barely understand. They walked along roads built by a vanished empire. They sheltered inside walls raised by engineers whose names had been forgotten. In abandoned cities, grass pushed between Roman stones, broken aqueducts crossed empty valleys, and ruined statues stared toward a world that no longer existed. To those who lived there, Rome had not simply fallen. It had become a memory of impossible order. For centuries, the Roman Empire had ruled much of Europe, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. Its armies guarded frontiers stretching across continents. Its officials collected taxes. Its ships carried grain, oil, wine, pottery, and luxury goods from one end of the known world to the other. Roman law reached into distant provinces. Roman coins passed through crowded markets. Roman roads connected cities separated by mountains, forests, and deserts. Then the Western Empire began to break apart. The collapse was not a single explosion. It was a long unraveling. Emperors rose and disappeared. Generals fought one another while frontier defenses weakened. Taxes grew heavier even as the government became less capable of protecting the people who paid them. Civil wars consumed soldiers who might otherwise have guarded the borders. Germanic groups crossed into Roman territory, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as refugees, sometimes as allies invited to fight on Rome's behalf. In the year 410, an army led by Alaric entered Rome and sacked the city. For nearly 800 years, Rome had not fallen to a foreign enemy. Now the impossible had happened. The city survived, but the illusion did not. Other invasions followed. Vandals moved through Gaul and Spain, crossed into North Africa, and built a kingdom around Carthage. Visigoths established themselves in Spain. Burgundians settled in parts of Gaul. Angles, Saxons, and Jutes crossed the sea into Britain. In Italy, imperial authority became weaker with every passing decade. Finally, in 476, a Germanic commander named Odoacer removed the young Western Emperor Romulus Augustulus from power. No thunder sounded across Europe. No messenger announced that an age had ended. Most people probably did not notice the moment at all. Farmers still rose before dawn. Merchants still counted their coins. Priests still performed the rituals of the church. Local rulers still demanded obedience. The Eastern Roman Empire, governed from Constantinople, continued to exist and would survive for almost another 1,000 years. But in the West, the imperial throne was empty. The political structure that had once united a vast territory had fractured into smaller kingdoms. Roman institutions did not vanish overnight, yet they became weaker, more local, and more difficult to maintain. Long-distance trade declined in many regions. Cities shrank. Roads deteriorated. Literacy became less common outside the church and a narrow elite. Great public buildings were no longer repaired. In some places, the stones of Roman temples, theaters, and baths were pulled apart and reused in walls, churches, and fortresses. Europe had entered a new age. Centuries later, scholars would call it the Middle Ages, as though it were merely a dark corridor between the glory of Rome and the brilliance of the Renaissance. But the people who lived through it did not believe they were standing in the middle of history. They believed they were living near its end. For many Christians, the world had a clear beginning and would one day have a clear conclusion. Famine, war, plague, eclipses, and strange signs in the sky could all be interpreted as warnings. The future did not necessarily promise progress. It might bring judgment. And yet, from the ruins of Rome, new worlds were already beginning to form. One of the most important rose in the lands that had once been Roman Gaul. The Franks were a Germanic people divided among rival leaders. Among them was Clovis, a warrior king who defeated his enemies, expanded his territory, and built a kingdom that covered much of modern France and parts of neighboring lands. Around the end of the 5th century, Clovis converted to Christianity in the form practiced by the Roman Church. That decision mattered far beyond his own lifetime. It brought the Frankish monarchy closer to bishops, priests, and the old Roman population. It gave Clovis a religious language through which conquest could be transformed into legitimacy. The alliance between kings and the church would become one of the central forces of medieval Europe. But Christianity itself was changing. In the final centuries of the Roman Empire, it had grown from a persecuted faith into the official religion of the imperial state. After the Western Empire collapsed, The church remained one of the few institutions that crossed the borders of the new kingdoms. Bishops often became powerful local leaders. They negotiated with rulers, defended cities, organized charity, preserved records, and sometimes acted as judges. Monasteries became islands of discipline in an uncertain world. Men and women withdrew from ordinary life to seek God through prayer, labor, fasting, and obedience. Some lived alone. Others formed communities. In the 6th century, Benedict of Nursia created a rule for monastic life that emphasized balance, order, humility, and a rhythm of prayer and work. The day inside a monastery was shaped by bells. Before sunrise, monks rose in darkness. They gathered to chant psalms. They prayed again throughout the day and into the night. Between services, they worked in gardens, kitchens, workshops, libraries, fields, and infirmaries. Some copied manuscripts one careful line at a time. The work was slow. A book could require months or years of labor. Parchment had to be made from animal skin. Ink had to be prepared. Letters were drawn by hand. Decorations might be painted with gold, crushed minerals, and rare pigments carried across great distances. A single mistake could ruin an entire page. Yet in these quiet rooms, texts survived that might otherwise have disappeared. The Bible stood at the center of monastic learning, but monks also copied works of Roman history, philosophy, poetry, science, and law. They did not preserve the classical world perfectly, and many ancient texts were lost forever. Still, without medieval copyists, much of what remains from Greece and Rome might have vanished. Far to the west, in Ireland, Christian communities became important centers of learning. Missionaries later traveled from Ireland and Britain into continental Europe, founding monasteries and preaching among communities that had not yet converted. Their journeys were difficult and dangerous. They crossed cold seas in fragile boats. They walked through forests where roads had disappeared. They entered the courts of warlords who might welcome them, ignore them, or kill them. Conversion was rarely a simple moment. A king might accept baptism for political advantage. His warriors might follow because loyalty demanded it. Old sacred places could be transformed rather than destroyed. Pagan festivals might be reinterpreted. Local customs survived beneath Christian names. For generations, the old and new worlds existed together. A farmer might attend church and still fear the spirits believed to haunt a nearby forest. A warrior might wear a Christian cross while honoring the traditions of his ancestors. A ruler might build a monastery and order the death of a rival on the same day. This was not an age of clean divisions. It was an age of mixture. While kingdoms rose and fell in the West, the Eastern Roman Empire remained powerful. Its people did not call themselves Byzantines. They called themselves Romans. Their emperor ruled from Constantinople, a city protected by massive walls and enriched by trade between Europe and Asia. Its streets held palaces, churches, markets, workshops, and crowded neighborhoods. Ships entered its harbors from across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian dreamed of restoring the Roman world. His armies reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, defeated the Ostrogoths in Italy, and seized territory in southern Spain. For a brief moment, parts of the old Western Empire returned to Roman control. But the victories came at an enormous cost. The wars devastated Italy. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Farms were abandoned. Populations declined. Imperial armies could conquer territory, but holding it was far more difficult. Then disease arrived. Beginning in the 540s, a devastating plague spread through the empire and beyond. Contemporary writers described cities overwhelmed by death. The exact number of victims can never be known, but the outbreak weakened economies, reduced populations, and placed new burdens on an already strained state. Justinian's dream of restoration faded. Yet his reign left monuments that survived the failure of his wars. In Constantinople, he built Hagia Sophia, a vast church crowned by a dome that seemed to float above the earth. Light poured through its windows and reflected from marble, mosaics, and gold. To those who entered, it must have felt less like a building than a vision of heaven made solid. Justinian also ordered the collection and organization of Roman law. Centuries later, these legal texts would influence scholars, rulers, and courts throughout Europe. The old empire was broken, but its ideas were still alive. Then, in the 7th century, a new power transformed the world around the Mediterranean. In Arabia, the Prophet Muhammad preached belief in one God. After his death in 632, Muslim armies expanded with extraordinary speed. Within decades, they had taken Syria, Egypt, Persia, and much of North Africa. In 711, forces crossed into the Iberian Peninsula and defeated the Visigothic kingdom. Muslim-ruled territories eventually covered most of Spain and Portugal. The Mediterranean, once the center of a Roman world, became a frontier between rival powers, but also a zone of trade, diplomacy, translation, migration, and cultural exchange. In cities such as Córdoba, scholars studied medicine, mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and law. Libraries preserved and expanded knowledge inherited from Greece, Rome, Persia, India, and the wider Islamic world. New crops, technologies, and ideas traveled westward. Centuries later, many ancient works would return to Latin-speaking Europe through translations made from Arabic and Greek. The relationship between Christian and Muslim societies was often violent, but never only violent. There were wars and raids, but also treaties and commerce. Merchants crossed religious boundaries when profit made cooperation useful. Rulers employed soldiers of different faiths. Scholars translated one another's books. Frontier communities borrowed food, music, language, architecture, and habits from their neighbors. Medieval Europe did not develop in isolation. It was shaped by the worlds around it. To the south stood the Islamic caliphates and kingdoms. To the east stood Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. Beyond them stretched trade routes leading toward Central Asia, India, and China. To the north lay seas crossed by traders and raiders. Across the forests and plains of Eastern Europe lived Slavic peoples, Baltic communities, steppe nomads, and rising states whose histories would become inseparable from the rest of the continent. The medieval world was larger than any one kingdom could see, but most people never traveled more than a few miles from the place where they were born. Their world was a village, a field, a church, a river, a forest, and the road that disappeared beyond the horizon. They lived close to the earth because the earth decided whether they survived. A good harvest meant bread through winter. A bad harvest meant hunger. 2 bad harvests could mean death. And above every village stood men who claimed the right to rule. In the Frankish kingdom, royal power did not remain stable. The descendants of Clovis fought among themselves, divided territory, and allowed powerful nobles to gain influence. Over time, authority passed into the hands of officials who managed the royal household. One family rose above the others. In 732, or possibly the following year, a Frankish leader named Charles Martel defeated a Muslim raiding force near Tours or Poitiers. Later generations would describe the battle as the moment Christian Europe was saved from conquest. The truth was more complicated. Muslim power in Iberia remained strong, and one battle did not decide the fate of an entire continent. Yet the victory strengthened Charles's reputation and helped his family claim a greater role. His son, Pepin the Short, removed the last king of the old Frankish dynasty and took the crown for himself. He sought approval from the Pope, and the Pope gave it. The alliance deepened. The ruler of the Franks offered military protection. The Bishop of Rome offered sacred legitimacy. Pepin's son would transform that partnership into an empire. His name was Charles, but history remembers him as Charlemagne. He was tall by the standards of his age, energetic, intelligent, and almost constantly at war. Year after year, his armies crossed rivers, forests, and mountains. They fought Lombards in Italy, Saxons in the north, Slavs in the east, and Muslim forces near the Pyrenees. Some enemies were defeated once. Others resisted for decades. The Saxon wars were especially brutal. Charlemagne demanded not only political submission but conversion to Christianity. Rebellion was answered with destruction, forced baptism, deportation, and execution. At Verdun in 782, Frankish sources claim that thousands of Saxon prisoners were killed on his orders. The exact details remain debated, but the campaign revealed the violence beneath the language of Christian kingship. Charlemagne wanted unity. He built it with swords. By the end of the 8th century, he ruled much of Western and Central Europe. His territory included modern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Western Germany, Switzerland, Austria, northern Italy, and parts of surrounding lands. Then came the moment that would define his reign. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Charlemagne attended Mass in Rome. As he knelt in St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head and proclaimed him emperor. The title carried the weight of the ancient world. More than 3 centuries after the Western Roman imperial throne had disappeared, an emperor once again ruled in the West. But what did the coronation mean? To the Pope, it suggested that imperial authority could be granted by the Church. To Charlemagne, it may have confirmed a power he believed he already possessed. To the rulers in Constantinople, it was an insult. They still considered themselves the true Roman emperors. The crown did not restore Rome. It created something new. Charlemagne governed through counts, bishops, abbots, and local officials. He sent representatives across the empire to inspect courts and report abuse. He issued laws, supported monasteries, and encouraged the education of clergy. Scholars came to his court from England, Italy, Spain, and Ireland. They corrected manuscripts, standardized writing, and improved schools. This movement is sometimes called the Carolingian Renaissance. It was not a rebirth of learning for everyone. Most people remained unable to read. Education served the church and government more than the ordinary population. Yet the reforms had lasting consequences. A clearer form of handwriting made texts easier to copy. Manuscripts were preserved. Latin was studied with greater care. The royal court became a center where ideas could move across borders. Even so, Charlemagne's empire depended heavily on one man. He spent his life traveling from palace to palace because no single capital could control such a vast territory. Loyalty was personal. Communication was slow. Roads were unreliable. Orders could take weeks to arrive and longer to enforce. When Charlemagne died in 814, he left an empire that looked powerful from a distance and fragile from within. His son inherited it. His grandsons divided it. Civil war followed. In 843, the Treaty of Verdun split the empire into 3 major parts. The division helped shape the future political geography of France and Germany, but at the time it created rivalry, disputed borders, and weakness. That weakness came at the worst possible moment. From the north, long, narrow ships appeared along the coasts. Their crews came from Scandinavia. They were traders, explorers, settlers, mercenaries, and raiders. Their enemies called them Northmen. Today they are remembered as Vikings. The image of the Viking has become so familiar that it is easy to forget the terror of their arrival. Imagine a monastery near the sea. The morning is quiet. Monks are praying. The building contains silver vessels, decorated books, stored food, and perhaps relics believed to possess sacred power. There are no walls strong enough to resist an army. There are no soldiers nearby. Then ships appear through the mist. Men leap into shallow water and run toward the shore. The attack is fast. Doors are broken. Treasure is taken. Those who resist may be killed. Others are captured and sold into slavery. Before a local ruler can gather troops, the ships are gone. In 793, raiders attacked the monastery of Lindisfarne off the northeastern coast of England. The violence shocked Christian writers. A holy place had been violated, and the sea itself seemed to have delivered the attackers. But Lindisfarne was only the beginning. Viking bands struck Ireland, Britain, the Frankish coast, the rivers of Eastern Europe, and settlements deep inland. Their ships could cross oceans, but also travel up shallow rivers. Paris was attacked. Seville was attacked. Constantinople faced Scandinavian warriors who came through eastern trade routes. Some raiders demanded payment in exchange for leaving. Rulers handed over silver, only to discover that payment could encourage another attack. Others hired Vikings as soldiers. Still others gave them land. In the early 10th century, a Viking leader named Rollo received territory in northern France. His followers settled there, adopted the local language and Christianity, and became known as Normans. Within generations, the descendants of raiders had become nobles. Vikings also settled in parts of England, Ireland, Scotland, Iceland, Greenland, and Eastern Europe. They founded towns, farmed land, married local people, and entered political systems they had once attacked. Scandinavian traders carried furs, wax, amber, weapons, silver, and enslaved people across enormous distances. They traveled along rivers toward the Black Sea and the Caspian. Some entered the service of the Byzantine emperor as members of the Varangian Guard. Far to the west, Norse sailors reached Greenland and then North America around the year 1000, centuries before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. Their settlement there did not last, but the voyage revealed the extraordinary range of medieval exploration. The Viking Age was not a simple invasion from north to south. It was a movement of people that connected distant worlds. But to the communities under attack, that larger history offered little comfort. Nor were Vikings the only threat. From the east came Magyar horsemen, ancestors of the Hungarians. They moved quickly across Central Europe, raiding towns, monasteries, and countryside. From the Mediterranean came Muslim raiders who attacked coasts and islands, established bases, and carried captives into slavery. Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries seemed surrounded. Kings were often too distant to protect local communities. A royal army might not arrive until long after the attackers had vanished. People turned toward whoever could defend them nearby. A powerful landholder with armed followers could offer walls, weapons, and horses. In return, he demanded labor, rent, loyalty, and obedience. Across much of medieval Europe, political power became intensely local. Modern people often use one word to describe the system that emerged: feudalism. But medieval life was never organized according to one clear plan. Customs differed from region to region. Relationships changed over time. Some rulers were strong, others weak. Some peasants were free, others legally bound to the land. Some nobles held land from kings, while others behaved almost like independent rulers. The word feudalism can be useful, but it can also create the false impression that medieval society operated like a perfect pyramid. Reality was more disorderly. At its heart stood land and obligation. A ruler might grant a noble the right to control an estate. In exchange, the noble promised military service, counsel, or financial support. That noble could grant part of the land to another warrior, creating another bond of loyalty. Agreements were confirmed through ritual. A man might kneel, place his hands between those of a lord, swear an oath, and rise as a vassal. The oath was personal and sacred. Breaking it could be described not merely as betrayal, but as sin. Yet oaths did not prevent conflict. A noble might owe loyalty to more than one lord. A king might demand service while another ruler offered a better reward. Families fought over inheritance. Castles became centers of protection and instruments of domination. The earliest castles could be simple earth and timber fortifications. A mound supported a wooden tower. Below it stood an enclosed courtyard protected by a ditch and palisade. These structures could be built quickly and placed near roads, rivers, towns, or conquered territory. Later, stone replaced wood. Walls grew thicker. Towers became stronger. Gatehouses were designed to trap attackers beneath arrows, stones, and boiling liquids. Moats controlled access. Keeps rose above the surrounding land as symbols of power. A castle protected the lord. It did not always protect everyone else. From its walls, armed men could control villages, collect taxes, enforce tolls, and punish resistance. The same fortress that sheltered people from raiders could also remind them who owned the land beneath their feet. Below the castle stretched the manor. This was the world most medieval people knew. A manor was not simply a grand house. It was an agricultural community that could include villages, fields, forests, mills, streams, workshops, pasture, and a church. The lord claimed rights over the land and the people who worked it. Peasant families held strips in open fields and owed rent through labor, crops, money, or some combination of all three. Many were serfs. A serf was not the same as an enslaved person, but neither was a serf fully free. Serfs could have families, possess goods, and farm plots for their own use. Yet they were legally tied to an estate. They might need permission to marry, move, or transfer land. They owed days of labor on the lord's fields. They paid fees to use the lord's mill, oven, or wine press. At death, the family could owe another payment before an heir took possession. The burden could be heavy, but the system also rested on custom. A lord could not always demand anything he wished without resistance. Villagers remembered traditional rights. They negotiated, complained, delayed, hid crops, ignored orders, appealed to courts, or rebelled. The medieval peasant was not silent. He simply left fewer written records than the people who ruled him. To understand the Middle Ages, we must enter his world. We must wake before sunrise in a house filled with smoke. We must step onto a dirt floor, pull on rough clothing, and listen to animals moving just beyond a wooden wall. We must live by the seasons, and we must learn how little separated survival from disaster. For a medieval farming family, the year began and ended with work. Winter was the season of cold rooms, salted food, stored grain, and uncertainty. A family counted what remained from the harvest and wondered whether it would last until spring. Firewood had to be gathered. Tools had to be repaired. Animals that could not be fed through winter were slaughtered in autumn, which meant meat might briefly be plentiful before becoming scarce again. When the ground softened, plowing began. The work was exhausting. In some regions, a light wooden plow could turn the soil. In the heavier earth of northern Europe, stronger plows with iron parts became increasingly important. Teams of oxen pulled through fields while men guided the blade and children cleared stones. Seed was scattered by hand. Every handful thrown into the ground was food that could not be eaten now, offered to an uncertain future. Spring brought hope, but also hunger. Stored supplies were lowest, just as labor became most intense. This difficult period before the new harvest was sometimes the most dangerous time of the year. Summer meant weeding, haymaking, repairing fences, tending animals, and watching the sky. Too much rain could rot crops. Too little could burn them. A storm at the wrong moment could flatten a field in minutes. Then came harvest. Everyone worked. Men cut grain. Women gathered and bound it. Children carried, collected, and guarded. Neighbors moved from field to field because delay could mean ruin. When the crop was safely stored, there might be feasting, drinking, music, and relief. But before a family could enjoy what it had grown, obligations had to be paid. The Lord took his share. The church took the tithe. Rent might be owed in grain, eggs, livestock, labor, or money. Seed had to be saved for the following year. What remained determined whether the family would survive. Bread was the center of life. For the wealthy, it could be made from fine wheat flour. For ordinary people, it might contain rye, barley, oats, peas, beans, or whatever grain was available. Pottage simmered in a pot over the fire, a changing mixture of vegetables, grain, herbs, and occasionally meat. Ale was common in many regions because it provided calories and could be safer than contaminated water, though people certainly drank water as well. Diet depended on place and status. Coastal communities ate fish. Forest regions supplied nuts, berries, game, and honey, though hunting rights were often controlled by lords. In Mediterranean lands, olive oil, wine, wheat, vegetables, and fruit remained important. In Northern Europe, butter, cheese, pork, cabbage, onions, and root crops appeared more often. The rich ate more meat and used costly spices imported from far away. Their tables displayed power. A feast could include swans, peacocks, boar, venison, pies, fish, sauces, sweetened dishes, and wine. Food was not only nourishment. It was theater. The poor rarely saw such abundance. Their houses were small, dark, and crowded. Walls might be built from timber, mud, stone, or woven branches covered in clay. Roofs were thatched. Smoke from the hearth escaped through openings or drifted through the roof. Privacy was limited. A family might sleep in one room, sometimes beside animals brought inside for protection and warmth. Fleas, lice, mice, and rats were familiar companions. Bathing did not disappear in the Middle Ages, despite the later myth that everyone avoided water. Towns could have bathhouses, and many people washed when circumstances allowed. But clean water was not always easy to obtain, fuel was expensive, and standards varied widely. Illness was constant. A cut could become infected. A difficult birth could kill mother and child. Tooth decay caused years of pain. Fevers arrived without explanation. Parasites weakened bodies already strained by poor nutrition. Doctors existed, but trained physicians were rare and usually served the wealthy. Most people relied on household remedies, local healers, midwives, monks, priests, and experience passed through families. Medicine mixed observation with inherited theory. Educated physicians often believed the body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on balance. Treatment could include changes in diet, herbal mixtures, purging, or bloodletting. Some remedies were useless or harmful. Others contained plants with real medicinal effects, even if no one understood the chemistry behind them. People also prayed. They visited shrines. They carried charms. They asked saints for protection. A sick child might be treated with herbs, while a candle burned before an image of the Virgin Mary. There was no sharp boundary between medicine and religion. Death was never far away. Infant mortality was high. Many children died before reaching adulthood. Adults could be taken by disease, accident, childbirth, violence, or hunger. Average life expectancy at birth was low partly because so many died young, but a person who survived childhood could live for decades. Families were formed under the pressure of loss. Marriage among peasants was both personal and economic. A household needed labor. Land, tools, animals, and inheritance mattered. The church increasingly insisted that valid marriage required the consent of the man and woman, a principle that could give couples some protection against forced unions. In practice, family pressure remained powerful, especially among elites whose marriages shaped alliances and property. Women's experiences varied enormously. A noblewoman might manage estates while her husband was away, arrange marriages, supervise servants, defend family interests, and sometimes command a castle. A merchant's wife might keep accounts, sell goods, train apprentices, or continue a business after becoming a widow. A peasant woman worked in fields, gardens, dairies, kitchens, and workshops while also raising children, preparing food, making cloth, and caring for the sick. The labor was essential. The authority was unequal. Medieval law and custom generally placed women under male power. Women had fewer political rights, fewer opportunities for formal education, and limited control over property in many regions. Violence inside marriage could be tolerated. Religious writers often repeated inherited ideas about female weakness or temptation. Yet women were never absent from medieval power. Queens served as advisors, regents, diplomats, and patrons. Abbesses could govern wealthy religious communities. Mystics gained influence through visions and writing. Women participated in markets, crafts, farming, healing, and resistance. Widows sometimes enjoyed freedoms denied to married women. The written record often speaks through male voices. But beneath those voices, the work of women held medieval society together. Children entered this world early. They played with simple toys, sang songs, chased animals, and listened to stories. But childhood did not last long. Peasant children helped with chores as soon as they were able. In towns, boys and sometimes girls entered apprenticeships. Noble children could be sent to other households to learn manners, service, religion, and warfare. A boy destined to become a knight might begin as a page, serving in a noble household. Later, as a squire, he cared for horses, cleaned weapons, practiced riding, and followed a knight into battle. The path was not open to everyone. Horses, armor, and training were expensive. Knighthood belonged to a military elite. The knight would become one of the most powerful symbols of the Middle Ages. But the reality was far more violent than the legend. At first, a knight was essentially an armored horseman. His value came from speed, training, and the terrifying force of a mounted charge. A warhorse was not a farm animal. It was bred, fed, and trained for combat. Armor changed over time, from mail shirts and conical helmets to increasingly complex combinations of mail, padded cloth, hardened leather, and eventually plate. A sword carried prestige, but a lance could break a formation. Maces, axes, spears, bows, crossbows, and later gunpowder weapons all had their place. Battles were dangerous, but much medieval warfare consisted of raids, sieges, ambushes, burned crops, stolen animals, and attacks on civilians. A castle might resist for weeks or months. Attackers dug tunnels beneath walls, built towers, launched stones, cut supply lines, and waited for hunger or disease to do what weapons could not. Defenders dropped stones, fired arrows, repaired damage at night, and watched their food disappear. When a town or castle fell after refusing to surrender, the result could be massacre. The ideals of chivalry grew partly from the need to control this warrior class. The church encouraged knights to defend the weak, respect sacred places, and limit violence at certain times. Poets told stories of brave warriors, loyal companions, noble women, impossible quests, and pure love. Courts celebrated courage, generosity, loyalty, and honor. But chivalry was an aspiration, not a description. A knight could praise mercy in a song and burn a village in war. He could kneel before an altar in the morning and rob travelers by evening. Noble prisoners might be treated well because they could be exchanged for ransom, while common soldiers were killed without profit. Honor often belonged only to those considered worthy of it. Still, the ideal mattered. It shaped behavior, literature, ceremony, and memory. Men wanted to be seen as honorable even when they failed to act honorably. That tension between image and reality would define much of medieval aristocratic life. Above the manor, the castle, and the battlefield stood the church. Its influence entered every stage of life. A child was baptized. A couple married before a priest. The dying confessed their sins. The dead were buried in consecrated ground. Bells marked the hours, announced danger, celebrated victory, and mourned loss. The calendar was filled with feast days, fasts, saints, and holy seasons. The church taught that salvation depended on faith, repentance, and divine grace. Heaven promised eternal joy. Hell promised punishment beyond imagination. Purgatory, increasingly defined during the Middle Ages, offered a place of purification where souls suffered before entering heaven. These beliefs were not abstract. They shaped decisions. A wealthy man might donate land to a monastery in hope that monks would pray for his soul. A warrior might make a pilgrimage to seek forgiveness. A ruler might build a church to display devotion and secure memory. Ordinary people gave coins, candles, food, or labor even when they possessed little. Relics drew crowds. A relic might be a bone of a saint, a piece of clothing, a fragment of the true cross, or an object connected to a holy life. Shrines claimed healing power. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles to touch a tomb, see a sacred object, or fulfill a vow. The journey itself could be dangerous. Roads were muddy. Inns were crowded. Robbers watched isolated paths. Rivers flooded. Disease spread among travelers. Yet pilgrimage created movement across a world where most people rarely left home. It connected villages to cities and distant kingdoms to shared sacred geography. Rome, Jerusalem, and Santiago de Compostela became major destinations. The pilgrim walked through fear toward hope. And as roads filled with pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, scholars, and messengers, the medieval world slowly began to expand. After centuries of insecurity, Europe entered a period of growth. Fields widened. Forests were cleared. Villages multiplied. Population increased. Towns returned to life. But before that transformation could fully unfold, one kingdom across the sea would be conquered in a single day. In January 1066, Edward the Confessor, King of England, died without a surviving child. His death opened the door to one of the most famous struggles for a crown in medieval history. Harold Godwin's son, the most powerful noble in England, was crowned king. But across the English Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that Edward had promised the throne to him and that Harold had sworn to support his claim. Whether those promises were truly made, and under what circumstances, remains uncertain. What mattered was that William believed, or declared, that the crown was his. He gathered ships, horses, archers, infantry, knights, and nobles hungry for land. The invasion force waited for favorable winds while Harold watched the southern coast. Then another enemy arrived from the north. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, invaded England with the support of Harold Godwinson's exiled brother Tostig. Hardrada was a legendary warrior who had fought across Europe and served in the Byzantine world. He came seeking a kingdom. Harold marched north with extraordinary speed. On September 25, 1066, his army defeated the invaders at Stamford Bridge. Hardrada and Tostig were killed. The victory was complete. Then news arrived. William had landed in the south. Harold turned his exhausted army around and marched back toward London and then to the coast. On October 14th, English and Norman forces met near Hastings. The English formed a shield wall on high ground. Norman archers fired upward. Infantry attacked. Cavalry charged. For hours, the shield wall held. William's horse was killed beneath him, and a rumor spread that he was dead. He lifted his helmet so his men could see his face and returned to the fight. The Normans may have used feigned retreats, drawing English warriors out of formation before turning upon them. Gradually, the shield wall weakened. By evening, Harold was dead. The exact manner of his death is unknown. Later tradition made famous the image of an arrow striking his eye, but the evidence is uncertain. What is clear is that England's king fell, and with him fell the old Anglo-Saxon ruling order. William marched toward London and was crowned on Christmas Day. But winning a battle was easier than conquering a country. Rebellions erupted. William answered them with castles, confiscation, and terror. In the north, his forces destroyed crops, villages, livestock, and food supplies in a campaign remembered as the Harrying of the North. Famine followed. Chroniclers described widespread suffering. Norman nobles replaced much of the English elite. Lands were redistributed. French became the language of the royal court and aristocracy, while English remained the language of most of the population. Over generations, the two languages mixed, transforming English vocabulary forever. Castles appeared across the landscape. They were military bases, administrative centers, and symbols of conquest. A wooden tower on a mound could rise quickly beside a town. Later, stone fortresses made Norman authority more permanent. William wanted to know exactly what he had taken. In 1085, he ordered a vast survey of landholding, resources, property, and population. Officials traveled through the kingdom asking who had held each estate before the conquest, who held it now, how much land it contained, how many villagers lived there, how many animals, mills, fisheries, and plows it possessed, and what it was worth. The result became known as Doomsday Book. Its detail was so overwhelming that people compared it to the Last Judgment, when no secret would remain hidden. Through conquest, record-keeping, and fear, Norman kings built one of the strongest monarchies in Europe. But England was not isolated. Its rulers held lands in France. Its nobles had families and estates on both sides of the Channel. English politics became inseparable from the rivalries of continental Europe. Across the continent, the centuries around the year 1000 brought enormous change. The old waves of invasion slowed. Vikings settled and converted. The Magyars established the Christian kingdom of Hungary. Local defenses improved. Political structures became more stable in many regions. Population began to grow. The reasons were not simple, and historians continue to debate their relative importance. A warmer climate in some centuries may have lengthened growing seasons. Forests were cleared. Marshes were drained. New villages were founded. The heavy plow expanded cultivation in northern soils. The horse collar allowed horses to pull more efficiently without choking. Horseshoes protected hooves. Watermills and windmills reduced human labor. The three-field system spread in many regions. Instead of dividing land into two sections, with one planted and one left fallow, communities could rotate autumn grain, spring crops, and fallow ground. This did not appear everywhere, and it was not a sudden revolution, but over time it increased flexibility and productivity. More food supported more people. More people created more labor. More labor cleared more land. The cycle transformed Europe. Old Roman towns expanded. New towns appeared near castles, bridges, monasteries, ports, and crossroads. Markets became more frequent. Merchants traveled farther. Coins circulated more widely. The town offered danger, crowding, disease, and opportunity. Its streets could be narrow and muddy. Waste ran through channels. Animals wandered between houses. Fire was a constant threat because buildings were packed together and often made from wood. Wells could be contaminated. Epidemics spread quickly. Yet a town also offered freedom from the routines of the manor. A runaway serf who lived in some towns for a recognized period could gain freedom under local custom. Merchants and craftspeople organized to defend their rights. Towns negotiated charters from kings, bishops, or lords, gaining permission to hold markets, collect tolls, build walls, and govern themselves. Urban communities became political forces. Their wealth came from work. Bakers, brewers, butchers, smiths, carpenters, masons, leatherworkers, dyers, weavers, tailors, candle makers, goldsmiths, and countless others filled streets with noise and smell. Workshops opened onto the road. Goods were displayed where customers could see them. Families lived above or behind the place where they worked. Craftspeople formed guilds. A guild regulated training, quality, prices, working conditions, charity, and religious life. A boy entering a trade became an apprentice in a master's household. He learned for years, receiving food, shelter, discipline, and skill. After apprenticeship, He might work as a journeyman for wages. To become a master, he needed money, approval, and sometimes a piece of work proving his ability. Guilds protected members. They also excluded outsiders. They supported widows and orphans, funded religious ceremonies, marched in processions, and guarded economic privilege. In many towns, guild leaders gained political power. Long-distance trade expanded. Italian merchants crossed the Mediterranean. Cities such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa built fleets and commercial networks. They carried spices, silk, sugar, metals, grain, timber, enslaved people, and luxury goods. In the north, merchants linked the Baltic and North Seas. Later, the Hanseatic League connected cities from England to Russia through a network of trade and shared interests. Fairs became temporary worlds. At great fairs in regions such as Champagne, merchants arrived from distant lands. Money changers weighed coins from different kingdoms. Contracts were written. Cloth, wine, salt, leather, metal, spices, and horses exchanged hands. News traveled with goods. A merchant might know the price of pepper in Alexandria, wool in England, and silver in Germany without ever meeting the people who produced them. This expanding economy created new wealth that did not come directly from land. That change disturbed the old social order. Medieval thinkers often described society as three groups: those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. Clergy prayed for everyone. Nobles defended everyone. Peasants supported everyone through labor. It was an elegant picture. It had never been completely true. Now merchants, bankers, lawyers, teachers, and urban craftsmen made it even less true. The world was becoming harder to fit into inherited categories. Education expanded with it. For centuries, monasteries and cathedral schools had preserved much of Latin learning in Western Europe. In the 11th and 12th centuries, growing cities and stronger administrations needed trained clerks, judges, physicians, and theologians. Schools attracted famous teachers. Students traveled to hear them. From these communities emerged the first European universities. Bologna became renowned for law. Paris became a center of theology and philosophy. Oxford developed in England. Other universities followed across Europe. A medieval university did not resemble a modern campus. It was a legal community of masters and students. Classes could take place in rented rooms, churches, or houses. Students were often young men far from home, and their behavior alarmed local residents. They drank, fought, borrowed money, and claimed special privileges as members of the clergy. The curriculum began with the liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Advanced students might study law, medicine, or theology. Books were expensive, so students listened carefully as a master read and explained a text. Lectures were arguments. Questions were tested through debate. Scholars learned to present objections, distinguish meanings, and defend conclusions. This method, later called scholasticism, sought to bring faith and reason into ordered conversation. The rediscovery of Aristotle transformed intellectual life. Many of his works entered Western Europe through translations from Greek and Arabic, often accompanied by interpretations developed by Muslim and Jewish philosophers. Christian scholars struggled with ideas that seemed both powerful and dangerous. Could reason prove truths about God? Could philosophy exist without threatening faith? What happened when ancient authority appeared to contradict Scripture? Thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas argued that truth could not ultimately contradict truth. Reason and revelation came from the same divine source, even if human understanding remained limited. The medieval university became a machine for disciplined disagreement. Its debates could seem distant from ordinary life, but the habits of legal reasoning, philosophical analysis, and institutional learning would shape Europe for centuries. The same age that built universities also built cathedrals. These structures rose above towns like stone mountains. Their construction could continue across generations. A child might watch the foundations being laid and die before the towers were complete. Architects changed. Plans evolved. Fires destroyed years of labor. Money ran out. Work stopped and began again. Yet communities continued. The earlier Romanesque style favored thick walls, rounded arches, heavy columns, and fortress-like forms. Then builders developed new ways to direct weight through pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses. Walls could rise higher and become thinner. Windows could grow larger. The Gothic cathedral was born. Colored light poured through stained glass. Stone saints, kings, monsters, animals, sinners, and angels covered portals and towers. The building told stories to those who could not read. It taught fear, hope, hierarchy, and salvation. Inside, incense drifted beneath vaults that disappeared into darkness. Choirs sang. Bells shook the air. Pilgrims moved toward relics. Merchants negotiated outside. Beggars waited at the doors. A cathedral was a house of God. It was also an economic project, a civic monument, a political statement, and a competition with neighboring towns. To build higher was to declare importance. To fill windows with light was to make heaven visible. But even as Europe grew wealthier and more confident, a different kind of religious passion was gathering. It would send armies across continents. It would create kingdoms, massacres, legends, and wounds that survived long after the warriors were dead. In 1095, Pope Urban II traveled to Clermont in central France and addressed a gathering of clergy and nobles. The Byzantine emperor had requested military assistance against Turkish forces advancing into lands once controlled by Constantinople. Urban transformed that request into something far greater. He called upon Western Christians to journey east, aid fellow Christians, and liberate Jerusalem. The response was extraordinary. Men shouted their approval. Cloth crosses were sewn onto clothing. Preachers carried the message from town to town. Warriors who had spent their lives fighting other Christians were offered a sacred purpose. Those who took part could receive spiritual benefits, including remission of penance for confessed sins. The expedition would later be called the First Crusade. The word crusade itself came later. Those who joined believed they were making an armed pilgrimage. Their motives were mixed. Some were driven by devotion. Some hoped for land, wealth, status, or adventure. Some followed family members or lords. Some wished to escape debts or failures at home. Medieval people could act from faith and ambition at the same time. Before the main armies departed, poorly organized groups began moving east. Along the way, crusaders attacked Jewish communities in cities along the Rhine. Men, women, and children were murdered. Some were offered forced conversion. Others killed themselves and their families rather than submit. The crusading movement began with a promise of holy war abroad and an eruption of religious violence at home. The larger armies followed separate routes toward Constantinople. Their leaders included powerful nobles from France and Norman lands. They did not form one unified force. They argued over command, supplies, territory, and oaths demanded by the Byzantine emperor. From Constantinople, they crossed into Anatolia. The journey was brutal. Heat, thirst, hunger, disease, and attack destroyed men and animals. Armies that had imagined glory found themselves marching through empty land while horses collapsed and supplies disappeared. They captured Nicaea with Byzantine assistance. They survived a major battle near Dorylaeum. Then they reached Antioch, a vast fortified city whose walls seemed impossible to overcome. The siege lasted months. Crusaders starved outside the walls. Some deserted. Others ate plants, roots, leather, or the flesh of dead animals. When the city finally fell through betrayal from within, the Crusaders were almost immediately surrounded by another army. Despair spread. Then a man claimed to have discovered the Holy Lance, the spear believed to have pierced Christ's side. Whether the relic was genuine, planted, or sincerely misidentified, it gave exhausted soldiers new courage. They marched out and defeated the besieging force. The survivors continued toward Jerusalem. In July 1099, they reached the city. Jerusalem was sacred to Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Its defenders prepared for siege. The Crusaders built towers and engines from timber brought across difficult terrain. After weeks of assault, they breached the walls. What followed was slaughter. Crusaders killed many Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Medieval accounts, written to celebrate the victory, described blood in the streets with imagery that may have been exaggerated for religious effect. Yet there is no doubt that the conquest was extremely violent. The Crusaders prayed at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They believed they had completed a sacred mission. Around them lay the bodies of the conquered. New Crusader states were established in Jerusalem, Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli. Their survival depended on castles, alliances, reinforcements, trade, and divisions among neighboring Muslim rulers. Life in these states was more complicated than constant war. Christians, Muslims, Jews, Eastern Christian communities, merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers lived within overlapping systems. There was exchange as well as conflict. Western settlers adopted local foods, clothing, architecture, and customs. Italian cities gained commercial privileges in ports. But the states remained vulnerable. In 1144, Edessa fell to a Muslim ruler, prompting the Second Crusade. Kings and great nobles joined, but the campaign ended in failure. Then a leader emerged who could unite much of the Muslim resistance. His name was Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. He rose from service under a powerful Syrian ruler, gained control of Egypt, ended the Fatimid Caliphate there, and gradually brought Egypt and Syria under his authority. He presented his struggle against the Crusader states as both political unification and religious duty. In 1187, the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem marched into a trap near the Horns of Hittin. The heat was merciless. Water was scarce. Saladin's forces surrounded the Crusaders and set dry grass alight, sending smoke through their ranks. Exhausted and thirsty, the army collapsed. The true cross, carried as a sacred standard, was captured. The king was taken prisoner. Many knights were killed or enslaved. Jerusalem could no longer defend itself. When Saladin entered the city, he did not repeat the mass slaughter of 1099. Many inhabitants were allowed to ransom themselves, though those unable to pay faced enslavement. Christian holy sites were largely protected, and Eastern Christians remained. The fall of Jerusalem shocked Western Europe. The Third Crusade followed. Its most famous leaders were Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, King Philip II of France, and King Richard I of England, later called Richard the Lionheart. Frederick drowned while crossing a river in Anatolia, and much of his army dispersed. Philip and Richard reached the eastern Mediterranean, but quarreled. Richard won major battles and captured coastal cities. He displayed great military ability, but also ordered the execution of thousands of prisoners at Acre when negotiations failed. He came close to Jerusalem but never attacked the city. The campaign ended with a treaty allowing Christian pilgrims access, while Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. The legend of Richard and Saladin later softened the conflict into a story of noble rivals. Both men were capable of generosity, diplomacy, calculation, and brutality. Medieval memory preferred heroes. History reveals rulers. The crusading idea expanded far beyond the Holy Land. Campaigns were launched in Iberia against Muslim states, in the Baltic against pagan peoples, and within Europe against Christians declared heretical. The language of pilgrimage and sacred violence became a weapon that popes and rulers could direct toward many enemies. The darkest turning point came during the Fourth Crusade. The expedition was intended for the eastern Mediterranean. Instead, debt, Venetian strategy, dynastic politics, and crusader ambition drew the army toward Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world. In 1204, Western Crusaders captured and sacked it. Churches were looted. Sacred objects were stolen. Homes were destroyed. Art accumulated over centuries disappeared into private collections or was melted down. Violence spread through the streets. Christians had taken the cross and attacked other Christians. The Byzantine Empire was divided. Although Byzantine rulers later recovered Constantinople, the empire never fully regained its former strength. The sack deepened hostility between the Latin West and the Greek East. The Crusades did not create contact between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Trade and exchange had existed long before them. Nor did they produce one simple outcome. They strengthened some monarchies and Italian trading cities. They increased the power and prestige of the papacy for a time. They moved people, money, weapons, ideas, and stories across great distances. They encouraged castle building and military orders such as the Templars and Hospitallers. They also left massacres, displacement, enslavement, debt, and hatred. For Jewish communities in Europe, crusading enthusiasm could mean sudden terror. For Muslims of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Crusaders were invaders who created foreign states through conquest. For Eastern Christians, Western armies could arrive as supposed allies and become predators. The cross promised salvation. In human hands, it could become a banner of destruction. Yet the church that launched crusades was not all-powerful. Its authority depended on a constant struggle with kings, nobles, cities, scholars, and rival clergy. Popes claimed spiritual supremacy. Emperors and monarchs claimed that God had given them authority as well. Sooner or later, those claims had to collide. One of the greatest confrontations began over a question that seemed simple: who had the right to appoint a bishop? A bishop was a religious leader, but he could also control land, wealth, courts, and armed followers. Kings wanted loyal men in these positions. Reforming churchmen insisted that sacred office could not be treated as a royal gift. In the 11th century, Pope Gregory VII and the German King Henry IV entered a bitter conflict known as the investiture controversy. Gregory declared that the Pope could depose rulers. Henry gathered bishops who rejected the Pope. Gregory excommunicated him, cutting the king off from the church and threatening the loyalty of his subjects. Henry's enemies seized the opportunity. In the winter of 1077, the king crossed the Alps and approached the castle of Canossa, where Gregory was staying. According to later accounts, Henry waited outside in the snow, barefoot and dressed as a penitent, asking forgiveness. The Pope eventually lifted the excommunication. It appeared to be a triumph of spiritual power over a king. But the conflict was not over. Henry rebuilt his position, invaded Italy, drove Gregory from Rome, and installed a rival pope. Gregory died in exile. Neither side achieved complete victory. The struggle continued until a compromise in 1122 distinguished between the spiritual and political aspects of a bishop's authority. Canossa became a symbol because it revealed the central tension of medieval government. A king could command armies. A pope could threaten his soul. Neither power could easily destroy the other. England witnessed its own version of the conflict in the 12th century. King Henry II wanted to strengthen royal justice. He appointed his close companion Thomas Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury, expecting cooperation. Instead, Becket became a defender of church privilege. The friendship collapsed into accusation, exile, and rage. In December 1170, after hearing the king's angry words against the archbishop, four knights traveled to Canterbury. They confronted Becket inside the cathedral. There, before the altar, they killed him. The murder horrified Europe. Becket became a martyr. Miracles were reported at his tomb. Pilgrims arrived in enormous numbers. Henry performed public penance and accepted humiliation before the shrine of the man he had once trusted. Royal power had produced a corpse. The corpse became more powerful than the king. Henry II, nevertheless, transformed English law. Royal judges traveled through the kingdom. Procedures became more standardized. Juries developed from groups of local men sworn to provide information. The king's courts expanded their reach, contributing to the growth of English common law. But Henry's family was a battlefield. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was one of the most remarkable women of the age. She had been Queen of France, joined the Second Crusade, obtained an annulment, married Henry, and became Queen of England. Her lands made the couple extraordinarily powerful. Their sons rebelled against their father, sometimes with Eleanor's support. The royal family fought over territory, inheritance, and love. Henry died after learning that his favored son John had joined the rebellion against him. Richard the Lionheart inherited the crown but spent little time in England. He fought in the Third Crusade, was captured on his return, and required an enormous ransom. After his death, John became king. John inherited his family's ambition without its military success. He lost most of the English crown's lands in France. He quarreled with the Pope. He demanded money from his barons to fund failed campaigns. Resentment grew. In 1215, rebellion forced him to meet his opponents at Runnymede beside the River Thames. There, the king sealed a document later known as Magna Carta. It did not create democracy. It did not grant equal rights to everyone. Much of it protected the interests of barons, the church, and privileged towns. Women, peasants, laborers, and the poor remained far from political equality. But Magna Carta contained a principle with explosive potential. The king was not above the law. No free man, it declared, should be imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, exiled, or destroyed except through lawful judgment or the law of the land. Justice should not be sold, denied, or delayed. John never intended to obey the agreement. The Pope annulled it. Civil war resumed. Yet the document was reissued after John's death. Over centuries, its original clauses were reinterpreted, mythologized, and transformed into symbols of lawful government. A failed peace settlement between a king and his barons became one of the most famous political texts in history. The Middle Ages often worked this way. People created institutions for immediate survival. Later generations discovered ideas inside them that their creators had never fully imagined. While English kings struggled with barons and French lands, the rest of Europe followed paths of its own. There was no single medieval Europe. There were kingdoms, principalities, duchies, bishoprics, republics, frontier zones, and empires. Languages changed from valley to valley. Laws depended on region, status, and custom. A merchant in Venice, a shepherd in Castile, a monk in Poland, and a farmer in Norway all lived in the Middle Ages, but they did not inhabit the same world. In France, kings of the Capetian dynasty began with limited direct control around Paris. Great nobles ruled territories larger and sometimes wealthier than the royal domain. Yet generation after generation, the monarchy survived, expanded, married strategically, confiscated rebellious lands, and built stronger institutions. Philip II defeated rivals and enlarged the crown's territory. Louis IX, later revered as Saint Louis, presented an image of Christian kingship built on justice, devotion, and crusading zeal. Philip IV taxed aggressively, challenged the papacy, and destroyed the powerful Knights Templar after arresting members on charges that included heresy and corruption. The accusations against the Templars were shaped by torture and political need. Their wealth and independence made them vulnerable. Their dramatic fall later inspired legends of hidden treasure and secret survival. But the historical reality was more direct. A king needed money. An order had enemies. Power found a religious language through which to seize what it wanted. In the lands east of France, the Holy Roman Empire remained a vast and complicated political structure. Its rulers claimed the legacy of Charlemagne and ancient Rome, but authority was divided among dukes, counts, bishops, princes, and cities. The emperor was not simply an absolute monarch. He was chosen through political negotiation by powerful elites. His influence depended on family lands, alliances, military strength, and the ability to persuade or intimidate subjects who guarded their privileges. Some emperors dreamed of ruling Italy and controlling the papacy. Italian cities resisted. Popes formed alliances. German princes took advantage of imperial absence. Frederick Barbarossa spent years campaigning in Italy. He sought to impose authority over wealthy northern cities, but the Lombard League opposed him. In 1176, imperial forces were defeated at Legnano. The emperor remained powerful, yet the cities preserved important freedoms. His grandson Frederick II became one of the most extraordinary rulers of the 13th century. He was king of Sicily, king of Germany, and Holy Roman Emperor. Raised in the culturally mixed world of southern Italy, he spoke several languages, patronized learning, studied nature, corresponded with Muslim rulers, and built an efficient state in Sicily. He also fought repeated wars with the papacy. Popes called him the enemy of the church. His admirers called him a wonder of the world. His enemies described him as the beast of the apocalypse. Frederick led a crusade while excommunicated and recovered Jerusalem through negotiation rather than battle. That achievement should have brought glory. Instead, because it was gained without papal approval, it deepened the conflict. His life captured the contradictions of medieval rulership. He could be curious, sophisticated, and ruthless. He protected some communities while crushing rebels. He valued knowledge but used violence without hesitation. He stood at the meeting point of Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Latin, Greek, German, and Italian worlds. When he died in 1250, imperial authority weakened. The Holy Roman Empire continued for centuries, but its fragmented structure became one of its defining features. Italy itself was divided. The papacy controlled central territories. The south was ruled by dynasties that changed through conquest. Northern and central cities such as Venice, Genoa, Milan, Florence, Pisa, and Siena became wealthy and often fiercely independent. Their towers rose above crowded streets. Their merchant families funded churches, armies, banks, art, and political factions. Citizens fought citizens. Exiles plotted return. Assassinations and vendettas could turn private hatred into public war. Yet these cities generated extraordinary energy. They developed complex financial tools. Bills of exchange reduced the need to carry large quantities of coin. Banking families extended credit across borders. Double-entry bookkeeping emerged gradually from commercial practice. Insurance helped manage the risks of shipping. The church condemned usury, understood broadly as improper profit from lending, but the expanding economy constantly created ways to work around restrictions. Money had become too important to ignore. In Iberia, Christian and Muslim states fought, traded, and negotiated across a shifting frontier. The long process later called the Reconquista was not one continuous national war. Alliances crossed religious lines. Christian rulers fought other Christians. Muslim rulers hired Christian soldiers. Territories changed hands through marriage, rebellion, tribute, and conquest, as well as battle. One famous warrior, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, remembered as El Cid, served both Christian and Muslim rulers at different points in his career. Later legend made him a perfect Christian hero. His real life belonged to a more complicated frontier. In 1085, Christian forces captured Toledo. The city became an important center of translation, where scholars worked with texts in Arabic, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Knowledge of medicine, philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, and ancient literature moved into Western European intellectual life. In 1212, a coalition of Christian kingdoms defeated the Almohads at Las Navas de Tolosa. Muslim power in Iberia then declined sharply, though the Emirate of Granada survived for centuries. The frontier produced art, architecture, language, food, music, and knowledge that could not be divided neatly by religion. It also produced persecution. Jewish communities lived throughout medieval Europe and the Mediterranean. Jewish merchants, physicians, scholars, artisans, moneylenders, farmers, and officials contributed to urban and intellectual life. In some places, rulers protected Jewish communities because they valued their skills and taxes. Protection could disappear overnight. Religious hostility, debt, political crisis, crusading enthusiasm, and false accusation repeatedly turned neighbors into targets. Jews were blamed for disasters they did not cause. Communities faced forced conversion, expulsion, mob violence, and massacre. One of the most poisonous accusations was the blood libel, the false claim that Jews murdered Christian children for ritual purposes. Another claimed that Jews desecrated the consecrated host. These lies had no basis in Jewish belief or practice, yet they spread because they transformed fear into certainty and gave violence a sacred excuse. England expelled its Jewish population in 1290. France carried out repeated expulsions and recalls. In parts of the German lands, massacres destroyed communities. Iberian Jews faced growing pressure that would become catastrophic near the end of the medieval period. The Middle Ages produced cathedrals, universities, and legal traditions. They also produced systems for excluding those declared dangerous or different. The Church's struggle against heresy revealed the same pattern. Religious movements emerged that criticized clerical wealth, questioned doctrine, or sought purer forms of Christian life. Some remained within the Church. Others were condemned. In southern France, a movement associated with those later called Cathars attracted support among townspeople and nobles. Their exact beliefs varied and are known mostly through hostile sources, but church authorities saw them as a grave threat. Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade in 1209. The campaign brought armies from northern France into the south. Towns were besieged. Populations were massacred. The crusade destroyed political independence as well as religious dissent. The phrase often linked to the massacre at Béziers, "Kill them all, God will know his own," comes from a later report and may not preserve the exact words spoken. But the destruction itself was real. To identify heresy more systematically, the Church developed inquisitorial procedures. Inquisitors questioned suspects, gathered testimony, and demanded confession. Punishments could include penance, imprisonment, confiscation, or transfer to secular authorities for execution. The medieval Inquisition was not one single organization operating everywhere in the same way. Its methods and intensity changed across time and place. Torture was permitted under regulated conditions and used in some investigations. Records show both bureaucratic procedure and profound injustice. The purpose was not simply to discover what people believed. It was to enforce the boundaries of an acceptable world. Even so, medieval religious life could be creative and rebellious. Francis of Assisi, the son of a merchant, rejected wealth and embraced poverty in the early 13th century. He preached repentance, cared for lepers, and described the natural world as a family joined in praise of God. His followers became the Franciscans. Dominic founded another order focused on preaching and education. The Dominicans became teachers, theologians, missionaries, and inquisitors. These new friars did not withdraw from society like traditional monks. They entered towns. They preached in streets. They depended on charity. They responded to an urban world the older monastery had not been designed to serve. Women also sought new forms of devotion. Some entered convents. Others joined informal communities such as the Beguines, living religious lives without taking permanent monastic vows. Mystics described visions, divine love, terror, and union with God in language that could be intensely personal. Hildegard of Bingen wrote about theology, music, medicine, and the natural world. Catherine of Siena advised popes and rulers. Julian of Norwich reflected on suffering and hope after surviving severe illness in an age of plague. Religious authority was male, but spiritual authority could sometimes allow women to speak where politics would have silenced them. Beyond Latin Christendom, Eastern Europe was changing as well. The rulers of Poland, Hungary, Bohemia, and Scandinavian kingdoms adopted Christianity and entered networks of diplomacy, marriage, literacy, and church organization. Kievan Rus linked Slavic, Scandinavian, Byzantine, and steppe worlds. In 988, Prince Vladimir accepted Byzantine Christianity, shaping the religious future of the region. Trade routes carried wax, fur, honey, metal, cloth, silver, and enslaved people. Cities grew along rivers. Monasteries and churches became centers of writing and art. Then, in the 13th century, riders emerged from the eastern horizon. They came with composite bows, disciplined armies, spare horses, and a reputation that reached cities before they did. The Mongol Empire had begun under Temujin, known as Genghis Khan. He united rival groups on the steppe and created a military system built on mobility, intelligence, strict organization, and terror used as strategy. After his death, Mongol expansion continued in every direction. In the 1230s and 1240s, armies under Badu Khan and other commanders invaded the lands of Rus. Cities that resisted were destroyed. Kiev fell in 1240 after a terrible siege. The Mongols then moved into Poland and Hungary. European armies met them with courage but little understanding of how they fought. Mongol horse archers attacked, withdrew, and drew pursuers into traps. Units coordinated across distances. Scouts gathered information. Engineers from conquered peoples operated siege weapons. In 1241, Mongol forces defeated armies at Legnica and Mohi. Hungary was devastated. Towns burned. Refugees fled. Europe seemed open before them. Then the Mongols withdrew. The death of the great Khan Ogdi and the political decisions that followed contributed to the retreat, though historians debate the full combination of reasons. The invasion did not become a permanent conquest of Central Europe. But in the lands of Rus, Mongol domination lasted far longer. Princes paid tribute to the Golden Horde. Political power shifted. Trade continued under Mongol authority, and connections across Eurasia expanded. The Mongol Empire brought destruction on an enormous scale. It also created conditions in which merchants, diplomats, missionaries, technologies, and disease could travel across vast distances with unusual speed. For a time, the routes from Europe to China became more accessible than they had been for centuries. A Venetian merchant named Marco Polo later described a journey to the court of Kublai Khan. Scholars debate details of his account, but his book filled European imaginations with cities, riches, customs, and landscapes far beyond familiar maps. Europe was becoming more connected to the world. That connection carried opportunity. It would also carry death. In the autumn of 1347, ships arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina carrying more than cargo. Many sailors were already dead. Others were feverish, weak, and covered with painful swellings. The authorities ordered the vessels away. It was too late. The Black Death had reached Europe. The disease was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. It spread through overlapping forms, including bubonic plague transmitted largely through fleas associated with rodents, and pneumonic plague capable of passing through respiratory droplets. Medieval people knew none of this. They saw only the result. A person could be healthy in the morning and dying days later. Swellings appeared in the groin, armpit, or neck. Fever rose. Skin darkened in places from bleeding beneath the surface. Some victims coughed blood. Pain, confusion, weakness, and terror followed. The disease moved along trade routes, roads, rivers, and coastlines. From Sicily, it entered Italian cities. It spread through France, Iberia, England, the German lands, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. No wall could hold it. No army could fight it. No social rank could command it to stop. Between 1347 and the early 1350s, tens of millions died across Europe and surrounding regions. The exact number will never be known. In many parts of Europe, perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of the population perished. Some communities suffered less. Others nearly disappeared. Numbers cannot fully reveal what that meant. Imagine one house falling silent, then another, then half the street. Priests entered rooms to hear confessions and became infected. Gravediggers collapsed beside open pits. Parents buried children. Children woke beside dead parents. Bells rang so constantly that in some places people stopped ringing them. Normal ritual became impossible. Funerals were shortened. Bodies were carried in carts. Graves filled faster than they could be dug. Wills were written in haste. Property changed hands repeatedly as heirs died one after another. Fear searched for meaning. Some believed the plague was divine punishment. Processions moved through towns in prayer. Groups known as flagellants traveled from place to place, whipping themselves in public acts of penance. Authorities sometimes welcomed them and later feared them because they challenged church control and stirred unrest. Others blamed the air, believing disease came from poisonous vapors or a corrupted atmosphere. Physicians wore protective clothing in later outbreaks, though the famous beaked plague mask is mainly associated with the early modern period rather than the first wave of the Black Death. People burned herbs, carried fragrant substances, avoided bathing, opened windows, closed windows, fled cities, remained indoors, prayed, drank, confessed, or surrendered to despair. Nothing offered reliable protection. The wealthy escaped to country estates when they could, but servants, supplies, and travelers carried disease with them. The poor often had nowhere to go. In this atmosphere, old hatred became murderous. Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells. The charge made no sense. Jews were dying from the plague too. Yet confession extracted under torture was treated as proof. Massacres spread through towns in the German lands, Switzerland, France, and elsewhere. Some rulers and church officials attempted to protect Jewish communities. Many failed or chose not to act. Entire populations were burned, expelled, or killed. The plague did not create anti-Semitism. It revealed how quickly prejudice could become a weapon when fear demanded an enemy. The disease eventually receded, but it did not disappear. It returned again and again for centuries. The first great wave left Europe transformed. Fields stood empty. Villages lost families. Monasteries lost monks. Workshops lost masters. Armies lost soldiers. Landowners discovered that land without labor had little value. Surviving workers could demand more. Wages rose in many places. Peasants negotiated lower rents. Serfs left estates in search of better conditions. Women entered roles left open by the dead, though authorities often tried to restrict their wages and opportunities. The old elite resisted. Governments passed laws attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and force laborers to work. Landlords tried to preserve obligations that no longer matched the new balance of power. But the world had changed. A worker who once feared replacement could now walk away. A peasant family could demand land. A widow might inherit property that had passed through several dead relatives. The plague did not suddenly free everyone, and conditions varied by region. In parts of Western Europe, serfdom weakened. In parts of Eastern Europe, landlords later imposed stronger controls. Social change was uneven, contested, and often violent. But the psychological shock was everywhere. Art filled with images of death. Skeletons danced beside kings, merchants, priests, and peasants. No rank could escape. Tombs displayed decaying bodies beneath idealized portraits of the deceased. Preachers reminded audiences that beauty, wealth, and power ended in the same earth. The message was simple: remember that you will die. Yet survivors did not only mourn. They inherited houses, tools, land, and money. Some ate better because there were fewer people competing for food. Demand for luxury goods increased among those whose fortunes improved. Construction resumed. Trade recovered. People married, celebrated, argued, sinned, prayed, and rebuilt. Human beings stepped over graves and continued living. The plague struck an age already under pressure. In the early 14th century, climate conditions had worsened in many regions. Heavy rain and cold contributed to crop failures. Between 1315 and 1317, the Great Famine devastated northern Europe. Grain prices rose. Livestock died. Hunger weakened bodies. Reports of crime, abandonment, and even cannibalism appeared, though extreme stories must be treated carefully. War added destruction. The most famous conflict began in 1337 between the kings of England and France. It would later be called the 100 Years' War, though it lasted more than a century with long pauses, truces, and separate phases. The roots were dynastic and territorial. English kings held lands in France and owed complex forms of homage to the French crown. When the direct male line of the French Capetian dynasty ended, Edward III of England claimed the French throne through his mother. French nobles chose Philip VI from the Valois line. The dispute became war. At first, England possessed advantages that surprised its enemies. English armies combined mounted nobles with large numbers of longbowmen. The longbow required strength, training, and constant practice. Its arrows could be fired rapidly and at great range. Used from prepared positions, supported by terrain and disciplined troops, it could devastate attackers. In 1346, near Crécy, the French army launched repeated assaults against a smaller English force. The attacks were poorly coordinated. Crossbowmen were disrupted. Mounted nobles charged through confusion and mud. English arrows fell in clouds. Horses panicked. Men piled upon one another. The result was a disaster for French chivalry. Thousands died, including great nobles. The old belief that aristocratic courage and mounted shock would decide battle had met disciplined missile warfare. 10 years later, at Poitiers, another English army won a major victory and captured the French King John II. A king of France became a prisoner. His ransom placed enormous strain on the kingdom. But battles were only part of the war. Armies conducted mounted raids known as chevauchés, burning villages, destroying crops, stealing animals, and forcing rulers to defend wide territories. The strategy targeted the wealth and credibility of the enemy monarchy. The victims were usually civilians. War became a season of fire. A village saw dust on the road. People fled toward woods or walls. Soldiers arrived, searched houses, broke doors, took food, and burned what they could not carry. The army moved on. The king claimed victory or loss. The villagers returned to ash. The French monarchy nearly collapsed under military defeat, ransom demands, factional conflict, and rebellion. In Paris, political unrest challenged royal officials. In the countryside, a peasant revolt called the Jacquerie erupted in 1358. Rebels attacked noble houses, driven by taxation, war, and hatred of an elite that claimed to protect society but had failed. Nobles responded with crushing violence. The revolt was defeated, but the anger did not disappear. England faced its own uprising in 1381. The government had imposed repeated poll taxes to finance war. Local officials attempted to collect payment from communities already burdened by economic controls and social resentment. Rebellion spread from southeastern England toward London. Peasants, artisans, laborers, and townspeople marched together. Some attacked records of servitude and debt. Others killed royal officials. They demanded an end to serfdom, lower rents, freedom of trade, and punishment of corrupt advisors. A radical priest named John Ball asked a dangerous question. When Adam dug and Eve spun, who was then the gentleman? The idea cut through centuries of hierarchy. If all humanity descended from the same ancestors, why should some people be born to command and others to serve? The young king Richard II met the rebels. Their leader, Wat Tyler, was killed during negotiations. The king promised reforms and persuaded crowds to disperse. Then the promises were withdrawn. Leaders were hunted and executed. The revolt failed in the immediate sense, but it revealed that ordinary people could imagine a different society. They did not merely complain about bad rulers. They questioned the structure of rule itself. Across late medieval Europe, similar unrest appeared in towns and countryside. Textile workers in Florence rose in the Ciompi revolt. Urban factions fought over representation. Peasants resisted taxes and labor demands. Mercenary companies wandered between wars, looting where governments could not pay them. The social order had survived plague and famine. It had not recovered its old certainty. The Church also entered crisis. In 1309, the papacy moved from Rome to Avignon, where popes remained for most of the 14th century under strong French influence. Critics condemned the wealth and politics of the papal court. When a pope finally returned to Rome and died, competing groups elected rival popes. Beginning in 1378, one pope ruled in Rome while another ruled in Avignon. Each excommunicated the other. Kingdoms chose sides according to political interest. Later, an attempt to solve the problem produced a third claimant. For ordinary Christians, the confusion was profound. If the Pope held the keys of spiritual authority, what happened when several men claimed to be the true Pope and each called the others false? The Western Schism ended in the early 15th century through the Council of Constance, which removed or accepted the resignation of rival claimants and elected Martin V. But the damage remained. The Church had survived. Its image of unity had not. Long before the schism was healed, critics had begun asking whether the Church's wealth and power had moved too far from the teachings it claimed to defend. In England, the scholar John Wycliffe attacked papal authority, criticized clerical wealth, and argued that Scripture should stand above the decisions of corrupt churchmen. His followers helped produce an English translation of the Bible and became associated with a movement known as Laity. Church authorities condemned his ideas. Wycliffe died naturally, but decades later his remains were dug up, burned, and thrown into a river. The act was meant to erase his influence. Ideas are not so easily buried. In Bohemia, the preacher Jan Hus drew inspiration from reforming currents that included Wycliffe's writings. Hus condemned corruption and called for changes in the Church. He traveled to the Council of Constance under a promise of safe conduct, hoping to defend his views. Instead, he was imprisoned, tried, and burned as a heretic in 1415. His execution ignited rebellion. Followers in Bohemia refused to accept the judgment. Crusading armies were sent against them. The Hussites, divided among moderate and radical groups, used mobile wagon fortifications, firearms, disciplined infantry, and religious conviction to defeat larger forces. Once again, holy war had turned inward. The rebels eventually fractured, but the conflict demonstrated that the Church could condemn a man and still fail to silence what he represented. Questions about authority were spreading through sermons, schools, towns, and courts. Who could interpret Scripture? Who could judge a pope? Could a corrupt priest still administer a sacred sacrament? Did wealth prove divine favor or betrayal? The answers would not fully break medieval Christianity until the Reformation of the 16th century. But the cracks were visible. Meanwhile, the 100 Years' War entered a new and even more dangerous phase. France had recovered much territory under Charles V and skilled commanders who avoided reckless battles. England suffered internal conflict, financial strain, and the deposition of Richard II. Then Henry V took the English throne. He was young, determined, and eager to unite his kingdom through war abroad. In 1415, he invaded France and captured the port of Harfleur, but disease weakened his army. He decided to march toward English-held Calais. A much larger French force blocked the route near the village of Agincourt. The ground was narrow and soaked by rain. French nobles crowded into a confined space. Many wore heavy armor and advanced through deep mud beneath a storm of arrows. Armor did not make a man helpless, but mud, exhaustion, crowding, fallen horses, and pressure from those behind turned the advance into chaos. Men suffocated beneath bodies. English soldiers moved in with axes, hammers, and blades. Henry won a remarkable victory. During the battle, fearing renewed attack and unable to guard large numbers of captives, he ordered many prisoners killed. The command remains one of the darkest parts of a triumph later celebrated as heroic legend. Victory opened the way to greater conquest. France was divided by civil war between factions associated with the houses of Burgundy and Orleans, later called the Armagnacs. In 1419, the Duke of Burgundy was murdered during a meeting with the French Dauphin's supporters. His successor allied with England. The French King Charles VI suffered recurring mental illness. Under the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, Henry V married the king's daughter and was recognized as heir to the French crown, displacing the Dauphin. It seemed that England might finally win. Then both Henry V and Charles VI died in 1422. The English claim passed to Henry's infant son. France was divided between supporters of the child king and those who recognized the Dauphin as Charles VII. English and Burgundian forces controlled Paris and much of the north. The remaining French cause looked weak, divided, and near defeat. Then a teenage girl arrived at court. Her name was Joan. She came from the village of Domremy in northeastern France. She said that saints had spoken to her and commanded her to support Charles, lift the siege of Orleans, and lead him to coronation. Her claim should have sounded impossible. She was young. She was a peasant. She had no military rank, no noble family, and no recognized place in the politics of kings. Yet France was desperate enough to listen. After examination by churchmen and royal advisors, Joan was given armor, a banner, and a place with the army heading toward Orleans. Her exact role and strategy is debated, but her presence transformed morale. She urged aggressive action, inspired soldiers, and became a living sign that God had not abandoned the French cause. In 1429, the siege of Orleans was lifted. French forces won further victories. Charles traveled through contested territory to Reims, the traditional site of French coronation, and was crowned with Joan standing nearby. The impossible had happened. A peasant girl had helped turn a disputed heir into an anointed king. But her success did not last. In 1430, Joan was captured by Burgundian forces and transferred to the English. She was placed on trial before a church court led by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a supporter of the English cause. The trial focused on her visions, authority, clothing, and obedience to the church. Joan answered with intelligence and courage, but the process was designed to discredit her and, through her, Charles VII. She was condemned as a relapsed heretic and burned at Rouen in 1431. She was probably 19 years old. Her enemies destroyed her body in public so that no grave could become a shrine. Her ashes were thrown into the Seine. But her death did not restore English victory. The alliance between England and Burgundy collapsed. French forces reorganized. Artillery became increasingly effective against castles and fortified towns. The English lost territory piece by piece. In 1453, French victory at Castillon ended the main phase of the war. England retained Calais but lost nearly all its other lands in France. The Hundred Years' War had changed both kingdoms. In France, the monarchy emerged stronger, with greater ability to tax, maintain forces, and control territory. In England, defeat deepened political instability. Noble families possessed armed followers and competing claims to influence. Soon England descended into conflicts later called the Wars of the Roses. The name came from symbols associated with the rival houses of Lancaster and York, though people at the time did not experience the wars as one simple contest between red and white roses. Kings were deposed. Battles decided succession. Noble families changed sides. Prisoners of royal blood were too dangerous to leave alive. Richard III took the crown in 1483 after declaring his brother's children illegitimate. The two young princes disappeared from public view. Their fate remains uncertain, though Richard has long been suspected of responsibility. In 1485, Henry Tudor defeated Richard at Bosworth Field. Richard died fighting, the last English king killed in battle. Henry became Henry VII and married Elizabeth of York, joining rival claims and founding the Tudor dynasty. Later writers would describe Bosworth as the end of the English Middle Ages. History rarely ends so neatly. Elsewhere, another date carried even greater symbolic force. For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople had stood as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. It had survived sieges, rebellions, plague, and the attack of the Fourth Crusade. By the 15th century, however, The Byzantine state had shrunk to the city and a small number of territories. Around it rose the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans had begun as one of several Turkish principalities in Anatolia. Through war, diplomacy, marriage, administration, and the absorption of conquered peoples, they expanded into southeastern Europe and Western Asia. In 1453, the young Sultan Mehmed II prepared to take Constantinople. He gathered a large army and powerful artillery. Among the weapons were enormous cannon capable of hurling stone balls against ancient walls. The defenders were few. Emperor Constantine XI commanded Byzantines, Genoese soldiers, Venetians, and other volunteers. The city's famous land walls had resisted attackers for centuries, but artillery was changing siege warfare. For weeks, cannon fire battered stone. Defenders repaired breaches at night. Ottoman ships were transported overland to bypass a defensive chain across the Golden Horn. Assault followed assault. On May 29th, the final attack began. Ottoman forces entered the city. Constantine XI disappeared in the fighting and became the last Byzantine emperor. Constantinople fell. Mehmed entered Hagia Sophia, which was converted into a mosque. The city suffered looting and enslavement, as conquered cities often did under the accepted laws of war of the age. Yet Mehmed also intended to rebuild it. He repopulated Constantinople with Muslims, Christians, and Jews and made it the capital of an imperial state. The Roman Empire, in its eastern form, was gone. The Ottoman Empire would dominate the region for centuries. The fall of Constantinople did not suddenly create the Renaissance, nor did all Greek scholars flee west only after 1453. Exchanges had been happening for generations, but the event carried enormous meaning. A city many Christians believed protected by history and faith had fallen to a new imperial power. The map of the world was changing. So was the technology through which people understood it. For most of the Middle Ages, every book had to be copied by hand. A manuscript was an object of labor. Scribes prepared parchment or paper, ruled lines, sharpened pens, mixed ink, copied text, corrected errors, and sometimes left blank spaces for decorated initials and images. Books could be beautiful. They could also be rare and expensive. Paper, developed in China and transmitted westward through the Islamic world, gradually became more common in Europe. It was cheaper than parchment and better suited to an expanding culture of records, letters, contracts, and study. Then, in the mid-15th century, Johannes Gutenberg and others developed a practical European system of printing with movable metal type, oil-based ink, and the press. The change was revolutionary. Individual letters could be arranged, inked, pressed onto paper, taken apart, and reused. A page no longer had to be copied from beginning to end by hand. Once type was set, many near-identical copies could be produced. Around the 1450s, Gutenberg printed a magnificent Latin Bible. The new technology did not instantly destroy manuscript culture. Scribes continued working. Printed books could imitate handwritten forms. Literacy remained limited, but the cost and speed of reproduction changed the scale of knowledge. Texts could circulate farther and faster. Errors could be multiplied, but so could corrections. Scholars could compare copies. Governments could issue notices. Merchants could use printed guides. Religious ideas could reach audiences too large for authorities to control easily. The printing press was born at the edge of the medieval world. It would help dissolve that world. Gunpowder had already begun changing war. Knowledge of gunpowder originated in China and traveled west through Eurasian networks. By the late Middle Ages, European armies used cannon, handguns, and other weapons in growing numbers. Early, firearms were slow, unreliable, and dangerous to use. They did not immediately make knights obsolete. Plate armor reached some of its most sophisticated forms during the same period. Cavalry remained important, but artillery altered the balance between walls and rulers. A stone castle that had resisted siege for months could be shattered by sustained cannon fire. Building modern fortifications required enormous expense. Kings with taxation systems and access to trained gunners gained an advantage over local lords. War became more centralized. It also remained intimate. Men still died in ditches, beneath hooves, from infection, hunger, and fear. Technology changed the method, not the human cost. Navigation was changing as well. Mediterranean sailors, Atlantic fishermen, Muslim geographers, Jewish mapmakers, Italian merchants, Iberian pilots, and many others accumulated knowledge of winds, currents, coasts, and stars. The magnetic compass, improved ship designs, better charts, and royal investments supported longer voyages. Portuguese expeditions moved gradually down the western coast of Africa. Their goals included gold, trade, Christian alliances, and access to markets beyond existing routes. They also participated in and expanded systems of enslavement that would grow into the Atlantic slave trade. The end of the Middle Ages was not simply a sunrise of exploration. For many people, it was the beginning of a new catastrophe. In Iberia, the Christian kingdoms of Castile and Aragon were joined through the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand. In 1492, their forces conquered Granada, the last Muslim-ruled kingdom in the peninsula. The surrender agreement promised protections. Over time, those protections were broken. Pressure to convert increased. Muslims and Jews faced persecution. The Spanish Inquisition, established under royal authority in the late 15th century, focused especially on baptized Christians suspected of secretly practicing Judaism or Islam. In the same year Granada fell, the monarchy ordered practicing Jews to convert or leave the kingdoms. Families abandoned homes where their ancestors had lived for centuries. They carried what they could. Many resettled in North Africa, Italy, the Ottoman Empire, and elsewhere. Also in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west under the sponsorship of Isabella and Ferdinand. He sought a route to Asia. Instead, he reached islands in the Caribbean and initiated sustained contact between Europe and the Americas. For Europe, the voyages opened paths to land, wealth, settlement, and empire. For indigenous peoples, they brought invasion, forced labor, disease, cultural destruction, and death on a scale no medieval conqueror could have imagined. A new age was beginning. It carried old habits with it. It is tempting to imagine that the Middle Ages ended in one dramatic moment. A cannon breaks the walls of Constantinople. A printer lowers his press. A ship disappears beyond the Atlantic horizon. A painter studies the human body beneath the light of an Italian window. One world dies, and another begins. But history does not move through doors that close cleanly behind us. The Renaissance did not erase the Middle Ages. It grew from them. The wealthy Italian cities that funded artists had been built by medieval merchants, bankers, guilds, and political rivalries. Universities that studied ancient texts had been founded in the 12th and 13th centuries. Renaissance scholars searched for manuscripts preserved by Byzantine, Islamic, Jewish, and Latin Christian communities. Printers reproduced works that generations of monks and scribes had carried through centuries of uncertainty. Kings who entered the early modern age relied on courts, taxes, laws, and bureaucracies developed by medieval rulers. Parliaments and representative assemblies emerged not from a sudden belief in equality, but from negotiations over money, privilege, and royal necessity. Town charters, guild rights, common law, and written contracts had all taken shape within the medieval world. Even the great ocean. Voyages carried medieval ideas. Explorers sailed with maps that mixed observation, ancient geography, religious imagination, rumor, and ambition. They sought wealth, Christian expansion, royal favor, and routes to legendary lands. The ships were new in important ways, but the dreams aboard them were old. The Middle Ages survived inside the age that claimed to replace it. So did its violence. Religious persecution did not end with the 15th century. It intensified during the Reformation and the wars that followed. Serfdom weakened in parts of Western Europe but expanded elsewhere. Monarchies grew stronger. Empires crossed oceans. Gunpowder made conquest more efficient. Printing spread wisdom, propaganda, hatred, faith, science, and rebellion with equal speed. The modern world was not born innocent. It inherited the contradictions of the medieval one. For centuries, people used the phrase Dark Ages to describe the period after Rome. The name suggested ignorance, superstition, filth, cruelty, and silence. There was darkness. There were massacres carried out in the name of God. There were peasants trapped by obligation, women denied authority, children lost to hunger, prisoners broken by torture, communities destroyed by false accusation, and entire regions burned for the ambitions of kings. But cruelty did not belong only to the Middle Ages, nor did ignorance. The medieval world also created institutions of learning that still exist. It produced philosophy, poetry, music, architecture, law, and systems of government that shaped later centuries. Its farmers transformed landscapes. Its artisans mastered stone, glass, metal, cloth, wood, pigment, and parchment. Its merchants connected distant shores. Its translators carried ideas between languages and faiths. The people of the Middle Ages were not waiting for the modern world to rescue them. They were living complete human lives. They loved their children. They feared death. They laughed at jokes that have not survived. They sang while working. They argued with neighbors. They cheated at games. They made promises, broke promises, mourned friends, desired status, searched for meaning, and tried to understand events beyond their control. A peasant who watched a cathedral rise above his town did not think of himself as a figure from a dark age. He saw stone reaching toward heaven. A student in Paris did not believe thought had vanished since Rome. He believed the universe could be questioned. A merchant in Venice did not see a closed world. She saw ships arriving with goods and stories from beyond the horizon. A monk copying an ancient text did not think he was preserving it for the Renaissance. He copied it because the words mattered in his own time. That may be the greatest mistake we make when looking backward. We turn people into bridges between ages. We remember them only for what came before or what came after, but they did not live between worlds. They lived inside their own, and that world was never still. It began among the ruins of Roman authority, when local kings struggled to hold fragments of power. It survived invasion, conversion, famine, and plague. It watched Charlemagne receive an imperial crown and saw his empire divide. It heard Viking ships scrape against unfamiliar shores. It built castles for defense and domination. It bound peasants to land and nobles to oaths that were broken as often as they were honored. It sent pilgrims towards sacred cities and armies behind them. It watched crusaders capture Jerusalem, Saladin take it back, and Christian soldiers sack Christian Constantinople. It placed popes against emperors, kings against archbishops, barons against kings, and peasants against the structure of society itself. It carved monsters onto churches and reasoned about the nature of God inside universities. It created saints, heretics, merchants, knights, lawyers, mystics, rebels, and conquerors. Then death came through the ports. The Black Death did not ask who prayed, who fought, or who worked. It entered castles and cottages. It destroyed families and weakened the chains that had held society together. Survivors demanded wages, land, freedom, and answers. The old order remained, but it could no longer pretend to be eternal. The 100 Years' War shattered the legend of noble battle beneath arrows, mud, artillery, and fire. Joan of Arc carried a banner into a world ruled by men and changed the fate of a kingdom before those men burned her. Constantinople fell beneath cannon. Printed pages multiplied. Sailors crossed waters that European maps had filled with uncertainty. By the end, the medieval world had not vanished. It had transformed itself so completely that later generations gave the transformation a different name. And still, the stones remain. They stand in ruined castles above rivers. They rise in cathedrals whose builders never saw them finished. They lie beneath modern streets that follow the paths of medieval markets and Roman roads. They survive in town boundaries, legal traditions, universities, royal ceremonies, languages, songs, family names, and stories repeated so often that legend has become difficult to separate from memory. When we imagine the Middle Ages, we often see a knight riding through mist toward a distant castle. But the knight was never the whole story. Behind him walked the people who fed his horse, forged his armor, built his walls, paid his taxes, buried his victims, and recorded his name. Most of their names are gone. History remembers kings because kings placed their faces on coins and their decisions in documents. It remembers bishops because churches preserved their words. It remembers warriors because victory demanded a story. But medieval civilization was carried by millions who left no portrait and no tomb that can still be read. The woman grinding grain before sunrise. The mason lifting stone above a city street. The child frightening birds away from a field. The sailor watching the color of the sky. The healer gathering plants beyond the village. The refugee walking from a burned home. The scribe bending over a page as winter light faded. They are the true scale of the Middle Ages. Not one crown, not one battle, not one faith, language, or kingdom. 1,000 years of human beings building order inside uncertainty. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes the order they built became another form of suffering. And sometimes, without knowing it, they created foundations upon which the future would stand. Rome had fallen, but law survived. Kingdoms had divided, but roads and trade reconnected them. Knowledge had narrowed, but it had never disappeared. Plague had emptied cities, but survivors filled them again. Walls had protected rulers, until cannon broke the walls. The church had claimed unity, until questions became too powerful to silence. The ocean had marked the edge of familiar maps, until ships crossed it. This is why the Middle Ages cannot be understood as an empty space between greater eras. They were the furnace in which Europe was broken, remade, and prepared to break the world beyond it. The age began with people staring at the ruins of an empire. It ended with new empires preparing to rise. And perhaps that is the final truth of medieval history. No civilization ever believes it is temporary. Every kingdom imagines its walls will stand. Every ruler believes his name will survive. Every age looks at the ruins behind it and assumes the future will judge it more kindly. The medieval people were wrong about many things. So are we. One day, others may walk among the remains of our world and wonder how we lived, what we feared, what we worshipped, and why we failed to see the changes already gathering around us. The Middle Ages are distant, but the human story inside them is not. History remembers the crowns, the crusades, the castles, and the plague. But beneath them all was the same struggle that shapes every age. The struggle to survive uncertainty, the struggle to turn power into order, and the struggle to decide what must be preserved when the world we know begins to disappear. If you could live for one day, anywhere in the medieval world, would you choose the court of a king, the streets of a great city, the silence of a monastery, or the life of an ordinary village? And for more long, cinematic journeys through the worlds that history left behind, subscribe and continue the story with us.